This week, the agenda looked at what our online world is delivering to our offline lives. We considered Canada's controversial anti-terror bill and evaluated what investing through a gender lens delivers to investors. But the agenda's weekend review begins this week with 50 years of the maple leaf. Well, for generations, Canadians were proud to sew the maple leaf on their backpacks and travel the world without their national identity in question. Joining us now as we consider what wearing that flag might mean in today's world in our nation's capital. Fen Osler-Hampson, Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Security and Politics Program at the Centre for International Governance Innovation Centre. John Ibbotson, Writer-at-Large with the Globe and Mail. And here with us in our studio, Supriya Dwivedi, Consultant with Crestview Strategy. It is a public affairs firm here in our city. Andrew Cohen, Professor of Journalism and International Affairs at Carleton. He's also a columnist with the Ottawa Citizen. And we welcome back John Blackwell in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, and Margaret Beto-Lawrence, also in Ottawa. Welcome to all six of you. Thank you. This is going to be a fun debate. Let me begin in Ottawa with our guests on the line. Fen, let me begin with you. Did the new flag that Canada adopted give us a new sense of nation?
I think it did. I mean, I'm struck by the observations of those who knew the debates at the time, that it was very heated. But I think it's fair to say that with the passage of time, Pia, familiarity has bred a great deal of comfort with the flag. And certainly when I travel and see Canadians, particularly talk to young Canadians, you know, they're very proud of their Canadian identity. They will have little pins on their knapsacks or on their jackets, you know, to really say, you know, we're Canadian, we're not something else. We're not British, we're not Americans.
John Ibbotson, where are you on this one? When the flag is born, do we have this new sense of nation here?
Well, I think it was part of a process. I was struck thinking back 50 years ago, how much time we spent agonizing over whether we were in fact a colony of Great Britain or whether we had become simply a colony of the United States. What did it mean to be Canadian? Who were we other than just not Americans? And you fast forward 50 years to the country we have today, which is confident, which is growing, which has a strong sense of its place in the world, a fabulous multicultural society that is bringing in more people than any other place on earth on a per capita basis, integrating them more successfully than any other place on earth. Wonderful cities that are being rated among the best in the world, especially Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. And a new generation, I think, that has completely put aside all of those old, ancient, tired questions about what Canada is. I think Canadians know emphatically what Canada is today, and I think they're very proud of it. And I think that flag is a symbol of that pride.
Andrew.
I can't disagree with anything I've heard. I do recall, though, in the 70s, the great pride of Canadian backpackers sewing that maple leaf on their backpacks. I've heard in recent years that's less so. Not that it's without pride, but Canada, as it takes positions in the world, as it, for example, went into Afghanistan and other places, which were, of course, the considered view of the government, duly elected government, that brought among Canadians a sense of, abroad, a skepticism that perhaps hadn't been there before when we were the peacekeeping nation, or seen to be the peacekeeping nation. So all to say that the flag has become that symbol. We're not traditionally a nation of flag wavers, but I think we've become more and more, and we do bring it out on occasions. And it is important to remember, Pia, that what Pearson was doing was part of an affirmation of Canada that had started in the early 20th century, 1909 when the Department of External Affairs was formed, in World War I when the Canada Corps was formed, 1931 when the Statute of Westminster allowed us to run our own foreign policy, 47 when we got our own citizenship, 49 when the Supreme Court became the last court of appeal rather than the British Privy Council. Pearson was acutely aware of status nationalism. And so when 64 comes around, he says one of the unfinished pieces, the last unfinished piece would be the repatriation of the Constitution, but one of the unfinished pieces was the flag. And it is important to remember today, really, as we've discussed, how vigorous the opposition was and how the Conservatives were on the wrong side of this issue, and to this day has still not come to terms with that fully.
Okay, we're going to pick up on a bunch of tendrils that you sort of laid out there as our conversation moves on. But Supriya, let me come to you. When did your folks immigrate to Canada? They immigrate here?
Yeah, they did. So I mean, my mother came here to marry my father, and my grandfather actually came here in the mid-60s as a professor.
And as you look back and talk to your family about when they first arrived, do you think that the flag at the time gave us a new sense of what it meant to be Canadian?
Sure, I think so, but would it have been any different if we had chosen a different flag? I mean, say for maybe the Beatles one, let's say, but had we chosen, you know, any other of those variations with the maple leaf, would our Canadian identity have suffered? I don't think so. I think we're more than a symbol, we're more than a flag, and I think our nationality runs much deeper than that, and I think that's a good thing.
Margaret, I mean, you have such a close tie to all this flag. What is your sense of what happened in, you know, when that flag was first raised on Parliament Hill? Did it, you know, redefine Canada?
Well, I don't know that it redefined Canada, but it certainly gave us our own distinct identity that separated us, that gave us that one extra step away from, you know, empire and dominion. I think it was part of a process, and I agree with what has been said that Canada has matured. I think that maturing process began before 1964 and proceeded on right through. I mean, I remember when I was in school in the 70s and 80s, in, you know, high school and university, that the big thing was Canada was a middle power. And, you know, I think that concept has become outdated now. We've gone way beyond being a middle power, whatever that was actually supposed to mean.
Well, Margaret touched on this. I mean, there's Diefenbaker. He's scared. He has fears that a new flag would break from what he saw as this great, glorious imperial past. Was he right to have those fears?
Yesterday, I was invited to a local school, and I gave a little talk about the flag to school kids. And one of the things I did was to play the clip of the lowering of the red ensign and the raising of the maple leaf flag on Parliament Hill for the first time. And it was an extremely somber affair. There were 10,000 people there. It was freezing cold. It was noon. And John Diefenbaker shed tears, as probably others did. John Diefenbaker was a devout Anglophile, ironically a German Canadian. But the amazing, and I must tell you also that prior to that event, George Stanley received a death threat through the RCMP. This person said that if you've killed our old flag, so you need to be killed. He was a defiant Albertan, and he wore his Hudson's Bay coat to the ceremony and stood out like a sore thumb in the middle of this formal dark attire. But George was interviewed in 1995, and he said, give it a generation. I predicted, give it a generation and it will be totally accepted. And he was absolutely right. I spoke with a retired Army officer from Vancouver a couple of days ago. And he said in the summer of 1967, he took the train from Vancouver to Winnipeg, and all across every small community was flying crisp new maple leaf flags and celebrating the centennial of Canadian Confederation.
Andrew, let me come back to you because you just sort of gave a nod to it there. I want to talk about foreign policy. So many Canadians took pride in that good standing that was reflected in Pearson himself. Just take us back. What was Pearson's foreign policy all about? What was the ethos of it?
Well, Pearson's foreign policy was what was called liberal with a small l, though some people might have called it a big L, internationalism. We were then considered, we had emerged from the Second World War in very good shape. We're the fourth largest military power. We used that, we leveraged that in the 50s with a very sophisticated foreign service, which in 1959, a rising senator named John Fitzgerald Kennedy called perhaps the best in the world. We were very good at using what resources we had. Peacekeeping was part of what we did. It was never all of what we did, even a majority of what we did. We were deeply in the Atlantic Alliance. NATO was very much Pearson's creation. In fact, he said it was his greatest achievement, the Atlantic Alliance. So we weren't just peacekeepers, but we had a sense, we had a military which was defined or called the best small army in the world. We were among the world's early aid givers. Our presence, that was the Canada that Pearson represented, and his intervention in the Suez Crisis in 1956 when he won the Nobel Peace Prize gave us that patina, I suppose. We always overstated what peacekeeping was, but that was very much how we saw ourselves: the helpful fixer, the honest broker, the country that was willing to do that, which believed in international institutions, particularly the United Nations.
Okay, that was then.
That was then.
Let's talk about now. I want to read something that John Ibbitson wrote in the Globe last year. Here we go, John. We're going to read what you wrote. Stephen Harper has discarded decades of liberal and progressive conservative foreign policy conventions. Canada, under the Conservatives, has reduced its role in multilateral forums such as the United Nations and the Commonwealth. The Canadian reputation for even-handedness has given way to a stout defense of democracy in the face of possible aggression, whether in Israel or Ukraine. Humanitarian aid has become economic development aid. Trade has become the top priority at foreign affairs. And on Mr. Harper's watch, Canada abandoned its Kyoto commitment to combat climate change. John Ibbitson, you want to add anything to that?
No, that's not a bad listing. It's simply a question of whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. Andrew described the Pearsonian tradition that we like to think we inherited. But Andrew also wrote a wonderful book back in 2004 called While Canada Slept, How We Lost Our Way in the World, I think it was, Andrew. Because by 2004, the Pearsonian tradition had become hypocritical. We weren't doing any peacekeeping anymore. Our army had become a joke. We no longer spoke with any authority in the councils of power. We had become what I called incoherent in our foreign policy, espousing one set of principles, but in fact not living up to them ourselves. The Conservatives have changed that. They have made the foreign policy far more muscular, louder, there's no question about that, much more aggressive and assertive. They also have, however, some pretty impressive accomplishments to put beside that, especially the big trade agreement with the European Union, with Korea, our involvement in Afghanistan, our leadership in the mission in Libya, the incredible work that Canadians did in Haiti after the earthquake. But you'll find, I suspect, if you ask some of the people at this table, that others think that this is a vulgar and Philistine tradition that we are now embracing under the Conservatives. I don't myself, but I know that that perception is out there.
I want to talk about a little bit more about Jordan's support for the coalition in these last few days since that video has come out. Currently opposing IS, King Abdullah says, yep, we're in this. What are you seeing in that? Is that going to stick?
I think Jordanian public opinion is fickle, and I think that, you know, the monarchy and the government shouldn't assume that this hurrah of nationalism is going to stay. At the moment, people are united, without a doubt. There is this feeling of, you know, wanting vengeance, you know, going after ISIS in full force. And just today, the skies are filled with F-16s flying over much of Amman. And Jordanians love that. You know, this is a way that, you know, they feel as though there's some retribution for this loss. But I do feel that there is still this really strong pacifist undertone. People are frustrated with the economy. They want jobs. They want bread on the table. Prices have gone up so dramatically in Jordan in the past 4 or 5 years. And there's an influx of Syrian refugees. That's where they see the real dynamic or problem in the Middle East. It's the Assad regime pushing out these millions of people into their country. In the northern part of Jordan, almost 50% of the population now are of Syrian descent, or of Syrians coming from the south. That's the visible reminder of the geopolitical problems of the region. ISIS seems so far away to most Jordanians, so they really are demanding more about a resolution on the Syria front and less about ISIS. I think that's going to come back.
Well, this is, you know, all these things are always connected. So as 4 years of Syrians, you know, coming across the border, no chance of going home anytime soon, you know, tens of thousands of them flooding in all the time. What has been the impact on Jordan, a country that already has so many refugees and Palestinians, 70%, perhaps as high as that, of Palestinian origin? What's the toll that this is taking on Jordan?
It's taken an enormous toll. I think people don't realize, and I've been to Jordan several times just last year, and you know, the unemployment rate has skyrocketed. Rental prices have gone up dramatically. Things like water, infrastructure, electricity has become increasingly in shortage supply. supply. Schools are overburdened. I mean, they're trying to take in Syrian refugees. So you can imagine a country that's already developing, already relatively poor, and now you have the influx of all of these, almost a quarter of its population. That's an enormous burden to take on. The traffic in the country is just ridiculous because of the number of cars. That's not to take into account the fact that you have on the border in Zatari, the refugee camp, hundreds of thousands of people in squalor, with no real future, as you said, to return. When will they make their way into the cities? And that's really going to be an enormous problem domestically for Jordan, and they're not really getting the kind of international support that they really need.
So as the F-16s are flying overhead, I mean, is that the king's way of sort of distracting his population from what you just suggested? Are the real problems that Jordan is facing?
Well, reverting to nationalism is also always, in every country, a cheap ploy.
It's good propaganda.
It's great national propaganda. I mean, why wouldn't you take advantage of it? You have the country united. You have this country, as you noted, has influx of refugees from everywhere, finally united around a cause. You take advantage of it. I think that's, as a political scientist, I can see why that would be the case. But to sort of mistaken the reality that there's still this great pacifist undertone and this feeling of, okay, we've diverted our attention away from fighting the Assad regime and looking at the real problem of the Syrian influx to now focusing on this faraway problem of ISIS. I think that message or that mood is going to come back.
Well, the federal Conservatives' proposed anti-terror bill has caused disagreement among politicos and Canadians alike. While proponents say the bill is a valuable tool to curb terror threats, others claim it is too far-reaching. Joining us now for more on Bill C-51, Christian Loyprecht, Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the Royal Military College of Canada, and Kent Roach, Professor of Law at the University of Toronto. Welcome to both of you. Okay, this bill, C-51, Christian, let me begin with you. Why was it introduced in the first place?
So I think just like in any other policy area, there's policy learning here. And so we learn some things that we know work and some things that could work better. And we do this in all policy areas. So to some extent, this is just a matter of trying to improve what we do and benefit from learning. But we've also seen, I think, a change in sort of the threat environment. And we've seen both, I think, a diversification of the type of threats. If we look at the type of charges that we see, individuals who are abroad, charging them before they ever return to Canada, recruitment charges, facilitation charges, charges for financing, charges for attempting to leave the country. And at the same time, we have this challenge of increasing, we're not dealing with large networks, but we're dealing with what we sometimes call trust ties. So one or two people, brothers, for instance, as we saw in France, who hatch these plots. And so it means you have a cascading threat environment, which means that security services are trying to keep tabs on a much greater number of individuals. If you're watching a network, if you're just watching the brokers, often that'll give you an indication whether something might be up. You don't need to watch everybody all the time. Whereas now we're investing a lot more resources into this very target-rich environment, trying to keep Canadians safe. And so it's trying to optimize what we do and make sure we do it in a cost-efficient way.
Okay, Kent, I'm going to get your response in just a sec, but just let's go through some of the highlights of this bill. Like most bills, it's pretty vast, but here's some of the highlights or lowlights depending on how you see this thing. Okay, it will, if passed, criminalize the promotion or advocacy of terrorism with a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. It will give CSIS the authority to disrupt terrorist activities. Those suspected of traveling by plane to commit terrorist offenses elsewhere can be put on the no-fly list. It will authorize arrest for those who may commit a terrorist offense rather than for those who will carry one out. And it will also increase information sharing among government bodies on national security matters. Okay, Kent, given what Christian said and what the highlights there are, do we need this thing?
I think it's hard to know. I mean, for example, there are some changes to preventive arrest and peace bonds. And we know that a peace bond was attempted to be issued for the Quebec terrorist attacker in October before he killed the warrant officer. But we don't know why the peace bond was denied. So one of my concerns is that we're making policy very quickly in a perceived emergency without giving the public enough information about why these changes are necessary.
So what's your solution then? Wait and see?
No, I mean, I think our solution, and Craig Forsays and I are trying to do this by publishing alternative backgrounders, is to get Canadians to think about the details of this legislation and to have a kind of robust debate that's not really tainted by, you know, slogans on either side.
This bill has raised criticism that it goes too far, Christian. What would this allow us to do in Canada, law enforcement agencies and governments to do that we can't do now?
So there's several key sort of novelties that are being introduced here. One is the ability for government departments to share data with one another. Just to give you one example, if the Department of Foreign Affairs and their export division catches on that somebody's trying to ship dual-use technology abroad, currently under the data sharing provisions, they are not actually in a position to share that information with CSIS. So we have a whole number of gaps that just seem to make not a whole lot of sense. Now, this is obviously tricky, and we need to make sure this is done in accordance with the Constitution and protecting people's privacy. But we have real gaps. We're also trying to enhance what's known as the CSIS mandate as a threat diminishing mandate, in addition to the mandate that it already has. So being able to be more proactive and taking actions to prevent certain types of activities. But it's important to note that these all have to be run by a judge, and they also, CSIS does not have any powers of detention or arrest under the way this bill is being introduced. It's trying to enhance peace bonds and recognizance and lowering the evidentiary threshold required for these. And so one of the challenges we currently have is that when it comes to terrorism, European countries have a better way of distinguishing between detention and arrest, where instead of always having to charge somebody and then having a reasonable chance of conviction, now having the opportunity to try to impose conditions on individuals who we think may be engaged in certain types of activity in an effort to get them to cease and desist. There's some changes with regards to security certificates and witness protection, so that the Crown doesn't have to divulge all its evidence. And with regards to the Passenger Protect program, as was mentioned, there are also now efforts to, rather than just have a board and no board decision by the minister and having to demonstrate that there's an immediate threat to aviation security, having a broader threat of somebody engaged in terrorist activity and having a greater spectrum of ways of trying to control individuals getting on planes, such as secondary security screening or sending them with an aviation security officer, for instance.
So there have been a couple of highly publicized studies that companies with female CEOs, board members, senior leadership perform better than those companies that do not have women in those ranks. What do you attribute that to?
Well, it's been actually nearly 10 years since Catalyst first came out with this study, and others have replicated it, showing that women on boards, women-led companies tend to perform better than companies that have less diverse boards. And that's mainly been based on US data. In Canada, TD Bank has recently kind of replicated that work and shown that basically the same results in the Canadian context as well, although maybe more sector specific, where in extractive and mining industries, we see the effect more strongly than we do in consumer products. But basically, the effect is holding in Canada and in the US. They claim this correlation between performance. Now, that we can't say that there's causation. It's not like women are on boards and therefore they are forcing companies to perform better. All we can say is that there's a relationship there. It could be just that very well-run companies attract more women, and so we can't necessarily make a causal claim. But on the other hand, investors shouldn't care about causality. Investors, as you pointed out in the introduction, just are interested in making money, and so a correlation should be enough. And unfortunately, we don't see a lot of investment products out there that are taking advantage of this data, even though it's been out there now for almost 10 years.
Okay, we're going to talk about some of those products in just a bit. But Susan, let me ask you. Sarah says, you know, we don't know exactly the cause. We know we know the effects, though. What do you think we can take away from reading into that companies that have senior leadership with women do better?
Yeah, Sarah did put it quite elegantly. For an investor who's looking for returns, what you want to figure out is what is going to indicate returns. And investors look at myriad calculations, indicators, ratios to determine which companies are likely to outperform, and that's the ones they invest in. This data has been out there for a long time, and we recently launched a product on it, but surprisingly, there has not been many that say, oh, look, this is a this is an interesting indicator in terms of correlation. The causation, yes, I'll let the academics try and figure that out. But in the meantime, it still seems like a good basis on which to form an investment strategy.
All right, I want to bring Jackie Vanderbrug into our conversation from Boston. Jackie's Senior Vice President, Investment Strategist at U.S. Trust. Jackie, hello.
Hello. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for being with us. I know we were having troubles connecting with you on the line. Glad you can join us. What do you read into that companies that have females in senior leadership are doing better?
So I think you have to look at this at a slightly more macro level, and we talk about it. You hear the term womenomics bandied about, but we really are seeing the fact that women's growing economic power is transforming the world. And so if you look at this aspect, both in terms of companies that have more women in leadership are going to be able to win that war for talent when more women have advanced degrees. They're going to be able to understand the growing female consumer dollar. 85% of the consumption in the world dictated by women now. They're going to be able to address other factors in terms of a team performance and the fact that we know that teams that are more diverse make better decisions. All of those pieces intersect to lead to, an understanding of why you would want to look at companies that have diverse leadership or more women in leadership.
Okay, here's the problem though. So we know the evidence is there. You get more women in positions of power, your company, your investors do better. And yet, Sarah, when we look at Fortune 1000 companies, I think 51 of them are led by women. Why aren't we doing better?
Why aren't we doing better? Well, there's so many long answers to that question. I would say a lot of it comes down to implicit bias. Most of us don't think of ourselves as sexist. We don't wake up in the morning saying, oh, let's try to discriminate against women. Certainly companies are feeling more and more pressure to increase the diversity in their organizations. And yet somehow this bias just keeps playing out. And even whether it's inside companies or in the investors, we're seeing this as well. There was a recent study that came out of Harvard that basically showed sometimes when women are added to boards, institutional investors are actually divesting of their investments. There's this sense somehow that the contributions of women are devalued, and there's lots of ways that can happen.
Jackie, what do you want to add to that point, which is that this is supposed to do good for the bottom line, and yet when we look at the playing field and the evidence on the ground, we just don't have enough women in these positions?
I think Sarah's right that there is this aspect of implicit bias, and researchers show over and over that this is not actually just a bias of men, right? That women investors will make the same decisions that a prospectus put in front of a woman and a man, but read by a different voice. Both women and men are going to choose to invest in the company in the male voice there. So we have this aspect, and I think what we take from it is that we need both men and women. Sarah and I write often about gender capitalism, this aspect that it takes all of us to look at this and say, how are we going to bring all of the resources, all of the talent, all of the possibilities of the human race together to solve the challenges that we have today.
Let me push back a little bit, Sarah, because given the numbers, we have a small sample size from which to draw from. We have so few female-led companies. Can we then, given that the sample size is so small, draw any real conclusions?
Well, this is something that academics have spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think it's absolutely true. The sample size is very small. We have the law of small numbers. We can't completely tell yet, but there are enough, at least in the United States, companies that are led by women or companies with boards that have some women on them. Again, it's not a great percent, but enough that there have been some more rigorous statistical analysis that's basically been able to show that there are changes in performance when women are introduced to the board or when women are in leadership. But we're still early days in that research. I think we're stronger in the domain of correlation than we are in the domain of really understanding these effects. And I think the fact that there are now a few investment products out there that are focusing attention on that is going to lead investors to actually put pressure on companies to improve their statistics, and then we're going to have more data.
Okay, we're going to talk about those products because both Susan and Jackie have them, but let me stick with you for a second, Sarah, and just give us the overview. So there's something called gender lens investing.
Right.
What the heck is that?
Well, it may be a little bit of an awkward term, so let me unpack all three of the words. Maybe let's start first with the word investing, because that's what we're talking about. So investing is any way that capital can be deployed. So it could be me investing in a mutual fund, it could be a company investing in a product, it could be venture capital investing in a startup. And then the second word we should pay attention to is the word lens, because a lens, think about the glasses that I'm wearing, it affects how you see the world. And so when you talk about a gender lens, what you're saying is let's see the world in a particular way where we can uncover opportunities that we haven't seen before. And because of this implicit bias we were talking about before, we don't know that we're seeing the world through a gendered lens, but we're seeing the world in a way that devalues the female contribution. And so what investing with a gender lens is meant to do is to say, let's think about gender, not just about women, because men and women are both involved, as Jackie pointed out, and let's think about all the ways that moving capital could change the equation. So why is it, for example, that only 6% of venture capital money goes to women-led businesses?
6%.
It's only 6%. Why are there also only about 6% of partners in venture capital firms are women? Very few women in the leadership in the hedge fund world, in private equity. So the people giving capital and getting capital, they don't seem to be women. How can we fix that problem? How can we think about directing capital and companies towards products that would benefit women and girls? For example, it's only recently that car companies have started testing their vehicle safety with female-sized crash test dummies in the driver's seat, as if somehow women weren't driving before.
You mean before they were in the passenger seat?
Yeah, they would put women in, but they were in the passenger seat, and only recently have they started to put them in the driver's seat. So, and that's another way you allocate your capital, your money, your investment choices in different ways. So investing with a gender lens has this very big umbrella to consider all of those different things, but one of the aspects of it is thinking about the ways we can move capital to increase diversity in companies, and the products that Susan and Jackie are involved with are ones that are actually favoring those kinds of behavior.
At the end of that last book, I was left with a question, Steve, which is, why do women all over the world live longer than men? So everywhere in the developed world, they live about 5 to 7 years longer. And I wanted to know why that was. And I knew some of it had to do with their social bonds. So for example, we know that women who get out and interact socially more often are more likely to keep their memories and have dementia less often. So that's really what started me on this journey. What is it about women's social interaction that promotes this health and resilience and longevity?
And you've called it the village effect. So what is the village effect?
Well, the village effect is a metaphor that I'm using to kind of express the kind of social contact that we need to survive and thrive. Because let's face it, not all social contact is created equal. But it actually, the book gets its name from a real village. And that's a story too, because when I was talking about my last book, I was sitting in a lecture hall in Toronto, in fact, when I heard an amazing fact. An evolutionary biologist gave a lecture and stood up and said, there is only one place in the world where men live as long as women, or nearly as long, and it's an island in Italy called Sardinia, a remote area, and in that place, that's where men live as long as women. So I sat up in my seat, and I thought, I'm going to go there and find out what is going on, not only the social factors, but the science that explains this. And so that's why I gave the book that name.
So you went to Italy, you talked to the men, you talked to the women. What'd you find out?
Well, I went to that remote part of an island off Italy where, incredibly, there are 10 times the number of centenarians as we have in Canada, and 6 times as many as there are in the Italian mainland, just 150 kilometers away. So there was something going on there. But one of the things I found out will be, I guess, resonant for you as a broadcaster, which is I arrived there, in fact, with my daughter who had just done a Zowski Fellowship, and we had a big, beautiful Marantz tape recorder, and we wanted to capture these centenarians on tape. And when we got there, every centenarian that we met was surrounded by this group of neighbors, friends, nieces, nephews, children, the priest, the shopkeeper, the barkeeper, and none of them could finish a sentence without being interrupted. So actually, the sound was not great, but that was the story.
Let's get a little sciencey here if we can. What's going on right here, right now, as you and I are having a face-to-face conversation, looking at each other, in each other's presence, that's so beneficial that even if we had 10 times as much contact via our BlackBerries or Skype or whatever else, it just wouldn't be the same?
Well, first, there's a whole cascade of neurotransmitters and hormones that are released when the two of us are across the table like this. You know, I'm looking at your eyes, we're locking eyes, and when you move your arms, and I kind of wave my arms around a little bit too. And so this mimicry and synchrony is telling us in a very kind of vestigial way that we're of one mind, okay? And it makes me trust you more. Because, you know, that might be a bad thing when you're on television. I was going to say, you don't
know me that well, that's why.
Exactly, right. But all of this, what's happening under the surface is that these neurotransmitters reduce stress. They give us a little dopamine rush so we feel rewarded, okay? And the stress gets tamped down not only right now, but well into the future, okay? And this trust is not only something that happens now either, but works into the future as well. So it's a very different interaction that we're having now than we would if you just sent me these questions over email and I answered them. I'm sure you'd get much more succinct responses. But the kind of liveliness of the exchange and the synchrony, the back and forth that happens in a real conversation would be completely absent, and the effects of that synchrony would be absent physiologically.
So you've actually identified empirical scientific evidence that suggests it's not only more fun, but it's actually better for both of our health if we do it this way, if we communicate like this. Yes?
Exactly, as long as we're not arguing.
Well, we're not yet.
Yes.
The night is young.
Right.
Now, all right, actually, maybe we should start arguing right here, because I'm looking at one of the charts in your book, and I know when I saw this, I really was quite astonished by it. What reduces your chances of dying the most? This is the chart that's fairly early on in the book. And you've got ahead of exercise, ahead of getting a flu shot, ahead of giving up heavy drinking, ahead of not smoking, strong relationships and social support. It is that much more important to good health than all of those other things?
Believe me, Steve, this was a shock to me too. And that's why it was so new to me. And I'm a psychologist, so I felt I should have known it. But that study was published in 2010. It is a meta-analysis of about 49,000 subjects, so it's not a small, eensy-weensy study. And what they did is they measured everything about people and their habits and then followed them through time with one question at the end. Who's going to still be alive and breathing at the end of 7.5 years? And then they looked at which factors were most predictive. So yes, believe it or not, more important than how thin or overweight you are, more important than how much you exercise or smoke or drink is your social interaction. But what's really interesting is it's not just your nearest and dearest who matter. It's also the larger circle. So this is why I call the book The Village Effect, because it's not just the people who you really depend on at times of need. That's what you call social support, and that is predictive. But also what's called social integration. What scientists mean by that is the people that you cross paths with day to day.
Let's look on the flip side then. For those who don't have the inner and outer circle, the supportive network, the village effect in their lives, from an evolutionary standpoint, how do we respond when we're isolated, when we have no one?
Well, the body responds as if it were in pain, as if there were a physical insult. And actually, the areas of your brain that become activated when you're experiencing physical pain are very similar to the areas that are activated when you're socially isolated. And this is why, for example, prisoners who are in solitary confinement, they can experience neural injury, neural kind of damage by being in isolation so long. It's so important to our survival as a species.
John McCain said that, right? That your former presidential candidate, John McCain, who was a POW, I guess, in Vietnam for, was it 5 years, 6 years, something like that?
Well, he said that being in solitary confinement was more painful to him than any of the abuse, physical abuse and torture that he suffered.
And this was a guy with I mean, they broke both his arms, they broke one of his legs. I mean, he lay there unable to get medical treatment for horrendous injuries, and he thought being in isolation was more painful than that.
Yeah, so a little fact that I think very few people know is that, you know, most of us know that if you have a headache, you can take a Tylenol and you'll feel better. What most people don't know is if you feel that your heart is breaking because you are suddenly alone in the world, if you take a Tylenol, you'll feel better. Okay? Because really, we are a social species, and being alone raises alarm signals physiologically that more or less tell you, if you don't fix this problem, you are a goner.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.